What's the crack? It's your boy Teriak. Back at it again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're motherfucking back.
I think it's safe to say that our luck has officially turned around, guys. We are back, baby. We are fucking back.
We're back. Yeah. Classic. We are back. We are back.
We are back. Welcome back, everybody. We got Tiny Pink Nuggets in chat. We got Bad Cramps, Gramps. Hell yeah, fuck the globalists, bruh. And we got Pseudo in chat. Welcome in. We got Redact as well. Welcome in, boys. Welcome in. Today, like I said, we're going to be going over a bit more of Jason Giorgiani and the Germans, as they say. We're going to be taking a look at the stream he just recently done over on Break the Rules with your host, Liv Polyekiv. But before we get into that, ladies and gentlemen, I've been our boy Trump. Yeah. Took an L flight over to China. Bangkok and the boys. You know what I'm saying? He brought the whole crew with him as well. Quality power move, as they say, ladies and gentlemen. But one sec. Got to do the goal. Unbelievable. I always forget to do something, chat. One sec. Rift break timer. Draw it down to there. Bada bing, bada boom. So we got the grift break going in. And as I checked the YouTube as well, I think we got the raid from Easy. So let me play the motherfucking clips, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome in, everybody. Welcome in. Don't forget to like the stream, of course. And if you want to open the panel, we do need to get to $50. And also, because it's easy, got to make sure we stay logical, boys. Otherwise, we end up emotional, like the women's. You know what I'm saying? And who better else to teach us the laws of logic than our boy Speakeasy?
Well, hang on, stop. Let's start with this. What are the 3 laws of logic? What are they? No, don't look them up. What are the 3 laws of logic?
Do you think this is an inconclusive
What are the
mathematical
3
statement?
laws of logic? There's 3. What are they?
I don't fucking know.
You don't know the fucking laws of logic, dude.
All right.
No, all right, dude. I don't know where. You don't even know the 3 laws of logic. This is fucking crazy. You're fucking crazy,
do you
bro.
want to ask Speakeasy if he knows?
Yeah, it's the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle.
His name is John C.
Anything else, shit?
Absolute legend. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? Do a little bit of rating. You know? Another day, another pay, as they say. You know what I'm saying? Also, oh my god, my voice is already going. Oh shit. Peace and peace. And as Tink, oh my god, Tiny Pink Nuggets was saying, like the button, guys. It's free. Goddamn free. It helps in the algorithms, all this kind of stuff. Section 230 as well says, good to see you, Teriak, our favorite leprechaun. I appreciate you. But like I was saying, if Brian Shaprio has taught us anything, ladies and gentlemen, it's about respect. Okay? Okay, Rob? It's a little thing called respect. Okay? And out of respect for the Chinese, you know what I'm saying? Our boy Trump and all that kind of stuff, bringing the whole crew over to China. I done the liberty of learning a bit of Chinese. Okay? Bai Zhao. Okay? Bai Zhao means white left. You know? It's a Chinese netizen. Right? So think of like internet and citizen. We just mash those words together. Netizen. It's an insult for those who only care about topics such as immigration, minorities, LGBT, and the environment, and have no sense of real problems in the real world. They are hypocritical humanitarians who advocate for peace and equality only to satisfy their own feeling of moral superiority. They are obsessed with political correctness to the extent that they tolerate backwards Islamic values for the sake of multiculturalism. They believe in the welfare state that benefits only the idle and the free riders. They are the ignorant and arrogant Westerners who pity the rest of the world and think they are survivors. Ladies and gentlemen, word of the day, Chinese word of the day. We want to be open. You know what I'm saying? We want to show, like I said, as Brian Shaprio says, that respect. It's all about respect, Rob. Okay? Bai Zhao. Alright? Bai Zhaos are a bunch of cunts. Okay? Over here in Ireland, we have the exact same word. It's called cunts. Alright? We call these motherfuckers cunts. You know what I'm saying? Education there for you, a little bit of internationalization. You know what I'm saying? They nailed on that. If there's one thing the Chinese are, they are precise. They are precise, Pseudo. Fair play to the Chinese, I must say on that one. Bai Zhao. Anytime you see one of these fucking rainbow colored hair cunts, Bai Zhao. Bai Zhao. Ni hao. You know what I'm saying? But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, we've been doing a bit on the Germans. And who better else to walk us through the Germans like our boy Giorgiani, okay? Like I kept kind of showing the particular stream on Jesse Michaels or Mitchell's, I think it's Michaels, Jesse Michaels, on his podcast where he basically goes over like, and he asked the fundamental question, listen, if the Germans had all this technology, right, and had all this like superior information, all these connections, these Spinne, you know, Odessa, as they would say. What why didn't they win the war? You know what I mean? And then you must ask the question, a lot of people don't want to ask themselves, did they actually win the war? What does winning the war actually mean? You know? Now, of course, we have the cats in chat as well. Meow, meow. Of course. About respect, Rob. It's a little thing called respect. But like I said, Giorgiani done a recent podcast with Lev Polyakov. Anytime he's on Lev's show, Jeremy talks about some real shit. But one thing to like decode from Giorgiani, especially when he's on Lev's podcast, is when he's talking about the UFO stuff. And again, I heavily recommend everybody checks out yesterday's episode, because we kind of explain a lot of the stuff that wasn't necessarily covered, at least by the big accounts from the UFO disclosure, at least the initial files, where a lot of people kind of jumped to the videos. Like, I even done that instantly as well. When I was on stream, they went live, and I think Crazy was on the panel as well. We went through the videos, and there's only so much a video can tell you, there's only so much a picture can tell you. It's when you dig around into the actual files themselves, the declassified files with the text, then all of a sudden you get to see a much clearer picture of what particularly like certain people mean when they're talking about disclosure, when they're talking about the UFO phenomenon, when they're talking about that kind of like aspect of what we're starting to see emerge. So with that in mind, a little kind of like cipher or kind of a keyword that Giorgiani typically uses is Nordics and the Greys. And this whole aspect goes in terms of the UFO disclosure. But think of like Nordics as the mythological figure that the Germans, or particular Germans, talked about. Now, does that mean that Giorgiani himself is a fascist? Fuck no. He's more of like one of these, like, think of like classical liberal, but like extremist classical liberal kind of thing. Like, think of like an extremist Jordan Peterson. That would be a fair way to interpret Giorgiani. But as a philosopher, he generally tends to kind of like, you'll kind of like, I say he's a communist if he's addressing with like a leftist argument that are a bit more kind of like past the liberalism and all this kind of stuff. But then like he'll also kind of like let out that he's, you know, more, let's say, nationalistic if he's talking to a right-wing audience, etc., etc. You know what I mean? But the key word that he uses, especially when he's talking about the UFO thing, is Nordics. That basically means these Germans that like came in through Operation Paperclip and all this kind of stuff as well. Let me catch up with chat before we go on. Asian insults are the best because their language is all reductive and simple. So when you get your own word, you know you fucked up. What can I say, man? Well, damn up, like fucking up, not necessarily a bad thing all the time. You know what I mean? I love how the Japanese for noisy, it's just 3 symbols for women in a triangle orientation. Mom, where? See, simples peoples. You know, winning the war equals establishing dominance in every major facet of reality. Exactly. It's a Weltanschauung, whatever the fuck it's called. A worldview war. A perspective on the world. And also Pseudo says, Arabic insults are fucking brutal. What can I say, man? What can I say? We need to step up our insult game. And that's another thing you need to call out chat on as well. Absolute disappointment. You know, Jungle came in here and just snagged the titles off all of you. Boys, what's going on? Where's Jack? Where's Dart? You know what I'm saying? They had to take a sick day today. You know what I mean? Purely because Jungle roasted them so hard. Unbelievable. Ladies and gentlemen, let me get into the fucking video. Enough shy talking. I've been shy talking for 15 minutes, hey. But let's get into it, boys.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another BTR stream. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov, and it is an immense pleasure to be once again with the one and only Dr. Jason Reza Giorgiani. It is a great pleasure to finally be here with everybody. It's been a very long time coming. It's been several months now, I think. I don't even know like how long it's been since we've last talked. And I think that right now it is a very special time. Everything is changing. And your new book, which I loved very much, Fundamental Thinkers, I think gets right to the point of what is at stake right now as far as the kind of person we end up building up from all these changes that are going on right now, from the internet-addicted last men that we're observing, as well as a lot of these third worldist types online that are creeping up, trying to get everybody to go after anything that has to do with progress. And that is one of the main things I think that really drew me to yourself, Jason, is that despite having a lot of views that people would consider to be, right wing and based and red pill, whatever you want to call it, you are nonetheless a progressive. And I think that people forget that in your work. And I just want to open it up to ask, why is it that you decided to write Fundamental Thinkers right now after all this time? And then I want to concentrate on the whole idea of how do we create this Übermensch, this overman, not just borrowing from Nietzsche, but borrowing from Heidegger, from Hegel, from Comte, from Aristotle, from Plato, bringing all these great minds together. So, Dr. Jurjani, once again, thank you so much for being here. And everybody, don't forget to like, smash that subscribe button, and comment and share this with everybody you know. And patreon.com/break the rules. Become a patron today. Anyway, Jason, you have the floor, my friend.
Lev, it's always a pleasure to be with you. I believe it has been 4.5 months, if I'm not mistaken. The last show we did together, yeah, it's been too long, and maybe later in the Q&A we'll get into where my head has been in the hiatus. But I think it was in New York in person that we did our last show together, if I'm not mistaken. And
no, I think it was right after that. We also did one about Iran.
Oh, yes, we did. So, yeah, we did. When I got back, we did a follow-up to the one in New York live. That's right. So about 4 months, 3.5 to 4 months ago, something like that. In any case, great to be back with you and your audience. Now, if anyone forgets that progress is at the core of my work, then they've forgotten essentially everything about what I stand for as a thinker. So, nice intro there. Yeah, I mean, look, the fundamental orientation of my work is in terms of evolution conceived not merely as aimless change, but as constructive development, and an ordered expansion of creative power and the complexity of consciousness, which is to say progress. And, we can get into how the ideas of order and progress are intrinsically intertwined and ultimately inextricable from each other in a way that Auguste Comte grasped very adequately. But yeah, it's at the core of my work. I mean, extending from my interest in an archaic proto-philosopher like Zarathustra, all the way to how it is that I interpret Nietzsche and Heidegger in a very different vein from some of those people on the right who somehow have delusions that these thinkers are, I don't know, affirming hierarchical, paternalistic, traditional modes of life. The people on the right who understand Nietzsche and Heidegger most adequately are actually the ones who condemn them. Like, for example,
Yes, right. This is philosophy, but when you look at the philosophers that he's bringing up, they are like primarily like German philosophers. You know what I mean? And when you look at like the aspect of Germany in those times, like Germany was ahead of like not only like everyone, like all these European countries around them, but also Britain, but also America too. Particularly like you see this manifest in technology, but also in terms of the philosophy and the philosophers that they were writing about. And like in those times, to be like a Nietzsche and to make the like bold claims of God is dead. And again, like he's been misinterpreted by, one could argue, like both sides of that, like, left wing dialectic. Like that was, you were making like some pretty serious claims, So in terms of the what would be perception, like it was a lot more difficult to be an atheist 100 years ago because there was, by the very least, a massive amount of societal shame and kind of like calling out per se in terms of like how retarded you would have to be to call yourself an atheist and all this kind of stuff. Do you know what I mean? Because as we're starting to reemerge and see is this whole aspect of like how are you able to ground anything if there is no supreme being? You know what I mean? And like this is what Giorgiani's trying to point out with the right wingers is like we ourselves are not supreme being. We are beings of becoming. You know what I mean? And that might sound like a lot of people don't get like the depth of like what I just said, because that kind of aspect of like getting down to the actual depths of like what is like being to begin with. You know what I mean? And it goes back to the like you mentioned as well, like Heraclitus, where it's like this kind of like thing of like opposites are kind of like one and intertwined, meaning like part of the definition of day, of defining what a day is becoming night, and part of what defining a night is becoming day. You get what I mean? So it's like you cannot define one without the other, or referring to one without the other. You know what I mean? So like that's this whole aspect of his whole thing, that he doesn't want like the culture and society to ossify around like one kind of like aspect of like supreme being, because then you're no longer becoming, and the fire basically diminishes, and you don't have any more creativity, and you don't have any more of that. You have this aspect of no, we need to contribute, and like that's the whole kind of like call to adventure, as Jordan Peterson would put it, in terms of like the hero story.
The really puritanical Evelyn's, who will adhere to Julius Evola's interpretation, especially in Ride the Tiger, of both Nietzsche and Heidegger as degenerates. So, and this is because, you know, Evola rightly recognized that although Nietzsche and then Heidegger in his wake are surmounting, overcoming a kind of naive enlightenment commitment to progress as a purely rational process of increasing understanding of the putative nature of reality, still both Nietzsche and Heidegger are committed to a kind of eschatological, you know, thinking, a kind of apocalyptic teleology that is ultimately progressive. And that I think is often mistakenly attributed to Christianity, whereas in fact, as Nietzsche understood well, it comes from the thinking of Zarathustra and was only perversely adopted and adapted by Christianity from out of the fundamental impact that ancient Iranian thought had on, you know, the Eastern Mediterranean cultural milieu, where Christian.
And this is another critique I have of Giorgiani. And this is the thing, you must be like this. If you call yourself a philosopher, what you should be announcing to people is like, listen, I'm going to take shots at everybody, even include myself. You know what I mean? It's like I keep trying to remind you all, please be patient. My mom took the Tylenols, okay? We're all fallible, we're all humans and all this kind of stuff. But I genuinely think that Giorgiani has too much of a one-dimensional critique and or aspect of Christianity and the depths that like Christianity actually holds. Particularly because like if you notice when he talks about Book of Job, and he kind of like he critiques it in a way, but like when you like analyze the critique, he's actually kind of like bigging up like the Jewish kind of like authorship of like the Book of Job. You equally have like this aspect of him being a so-called like Promethean and all this kind of stuff. But then when you put like side by side with Prometheus and Jesus, you know what I mean? They even sound similar for a reason. And the books are written in ancient Greek, etc., etc. I'll let you kind of fill in the blanks there. So it's like, if you're going to have like some sort of reverence for the Jew, you must also have some sort of reverence for the Christian, which Giorgiani doesn't seem to have. But I think that like this is because Giorgiani's very conscious of like the like the sewing circle Christians, that like if anybody from the Crucible here would realize, like that's like what Andrew spends a lot of time doing, calling out these sewing circle Christians, this was it like feigning of the pious, you know, purity culture kind of type things. Even our boy Jim Bob.
Machiwa, Reggie. Machiwa.
Like this kind of like that whole aspect. Do you know what I mean? And I think because of Orthodox's limited numbers, let's say at the moment, because you are starting to see a rise in Orthodoxy in America, But at the moment, in terms of like orthodoxy, because it's not the majority. I think the majority is Roman Catholics, and in America particularly, I think it's evangelicals. You see a lot of like the fake piousness or purity culture kind of like ring out, and that often like typically when you hear of like these atheists doing their whole like spiel of like when they left the church, typically kind of like one of those areas, like one of these churches. So this is what I always say, it's like, don't try to talk to me about like proving a particular story or the particular characters of a story in the Bible exists. That to me is a dull or a boring conversation. Because at the end of the day, like to criticize myself, like there's no evidence that Socrates ever existed. There's no evidence that Plato existed, all this kind of stuff. You know what I mean? And to me, it's like the definition, literally, of an ad hom fallacy. You're going after the actual person and not the argument. Talking about the Sermon on the Mount. Talking about the teachings. You know what I mean? So, like I said, like once you kind of like operate on that level, you start to see the good in people you may have previously seen as enemies. Let me catch up in chat as well. External pressure, yeah, that's a good way of describing it, against the atheists was very real, but it was kind of one of those things that is like we need to get back to the good old days where we call these atheists retarded, and I called them out as like, you have no grounding, that's why you're inevitably going to end up with more relativity and nihilism, you know what I mean? Bad Gramps saying the Harbingers, like, let me get the full thing on it, because it's a cool word that, again, like people don't They don't use the cool words anymore, as they say. But Harbinger is a person, event, or thing that signals, foreshadows, or announces the approach of another. You know what I'm saying? Hold up that light, you know? Shadi says, yeah, they all put the pressure on me to roast Jungle, and they just let him roast them all. But if I remember correctly, so did you. What was this? I said from the get-go, Shadi, let's see who gets the belt. And part of that is you're going to have to roast the host as well. You know what I mean? It is what it is, Shante. But I think we can agree, Shante, like the most people that I'm disappointed in is the boys. Like, Jack got roasted so hard from, I think, like one roast that he started bringing up the steak story again. You know what I mean? Like, Jack started having like the microwave flashbacks. You know, it was like PTSD for him. I was just like, boys, what are we doing here? What are we doing? We're supposed to show up. Unbelievable. Anyways. Background Grab says, I would have roasted them if I fell asleep though. Hey, it is what it is. It is what it is. I'm mainly calling out Darth and Jack, the boys. The regulars. What's going on here, boys? You know what I mean? Tears are just weakness leaving the body. Exactly, Redact. Exactly. He had built whole storylines to his roles. 100%. It was like, it was depth there. You know what I'm saying? There was thought. Also, like it was very kind of like quippy and vivid in terms of the imagery as well. Like you type like your keyboard fell down the stairs. Bellissimo. Bellissimo. You know what I'm saying? You wanted to do Dr. Seuss roast battle. I could not hang. It is what it is. It is what it is. Don't take it personally. I got roasted. I just laughed. 100%. 100%. You know what I'm saying? Do you think Shantae actually cried? Nah, man. She's just fishing for sympathy. Fuck that. You know what I mean? Well, I'm very behind the stream. Yeah, 100%. I'm catching up myself as well. He seems like a smart cookie. 100%. I did. It was a joke. It was a joke. Literalism doesn't bring any, or is that liberalism? Doesn't bring any value to the allegory provided. Oh yes, in terms of like when you view Christianity. I've seen one video where it's like there's literally a certain quote in, pretty sure it's the New Testament, but like basically like Jesus contradicts himself. I don't know if it was in the New Testament, but it was basically, it's like something got to do with like arguing with a fool, like do not meet a fool with his folly, and then right after it says but meet a fool with his folly. You know what I mean? And the eights will say, see, it's contradiction, ergo we have to throw the whole book out. And it's like, no. It's like when I say truth is what is. And you're like, oh, Teriak, that doesn't make any sense. Like, no, like actually think about truth is what is. False is what is not. You know what I mean? It's the same kind of aspect where it's like on the one hand you don't want to engage in a fool's folly with like the insult game and dragging each other down and all this kind of shit. But you do want to meet the fool's folly in the sense of the like the what they call the virtue signal. You know what I mean? So it's like if you're able to take on the fool's argument of like the actual virtue behind the virtue signal, while their argument does not necessarily get them the virtue, but to engage in that part of the argument and show them that this is false virtue or that this virtue is much better achieved in terms of the actual wisdom that we see in Christianity, that's why you engage with the fool with the folly. But you don't want to engage with the fool in this folly in terms of just straight up insulting each other and all this kind of shit, because then it's where do we get each other? You know what I mean? So, like I said, food for thought, as they say. I swear he was using the AI some sort to come up with them so fast. Oh man, like when you got the gift of the gab, you know what I mean? It just comes to you. It's like he's like a channeler. Channelingus? What the fuck? He basically he's divining revelation from the roast gods. It is what it is. How's me roasting Jack about the steaks again? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But Jack was roasting himself. Like it's like in when you're playing the Pokemon game, and then like there's some Pokemon that confuse your Pokemon, and your Pokemon starts attacking itself. I was like, Pikachu was hitting himself with Thunderbolt. What the fuck's going on here, boys? This is unbelievable. He's had the numbers advantage, and what the fuck did you just do with it? Absolutely nothing. You know, it is what it is. Yes, literalism is just a pitfall. Well, like that's the thing, you know, and it's this whole aspect of the need to be right. So even seeing it there on the Nora Prep show, where it's like they will go out of their way trying to be as literal as possible, just so they can say, "Aha, you're wrong, I'm right." You know what I mean? This need to be right, you know. It's unfortunate because, like I said, once you realize it and you see the big picture, you're like, oh my god, this is a thing of beauty. Butter that bread, but you can butter the bread, but do not, signore, break the spaghetti. Okay? You know I break the spaghetti, or Pepe will be unhappy. Okay? I need a dictionary to watch this channel. What can I say, man? What can I say? Expand the horizons, you know? Where we learn to enunciate our words and expand our vocabulary. So we can speak most parliamentary language. Same. Hey, that's disclaimer. Bring your fucking dictionaries, okay? We're here to educate ourselves. Grilling beans and macaroni, microwaving steaks. Oh, we got a song here. We got ourselves a song here. The Fool's Folly verse isn't much of a contradiction, as it's about situational wisdom of knowing when to avoid pointless arguments versus the correct error to prevent arrogance. Exactly. You know? But that gets echoed in terms of like Jesus's, and I think this is one of Jesus' best liners, of like the love your enemy. Look for the good in the argument that they're making. And if it's all just insult, then just ignore him. You know, let the fool expose himself. You know? But when they virtue signal, that's when you make your attack. And on those grounds, you expose the fool. You know? I can't do the small words good. But I'll try, boss. But anyways, let's get into it.
Christianity arose in the Hellenistic era. So in any case, as a proviso, few remarks on progress. Why did I decide to write this book? Well, this is a subject that I addressed in my recent interview with the warrior philosopher, with our friend Patrick, who, by the way, is the co-publisher of this book. This is the first book that I have published with DVX, with their nice Roman, icon. So their nice Roman totem on their logo. Patrick and Lance Legion run DVX Press, and I'm very happy to be working with them. This is going to be the first of a series of volumes that will be published by DVX. By series, I don't mean that one is necessarily connected to the other insofar as you have to read any one before another. But it's going to be essentially a set of books that publishes my various essays in a more or less thematic way. And this is the first of them. The next one is going to be on the occult. It's going to be a much thicker volume of essays on the occult. So I hate to repeat myself in one interview after another. Therefore, and we'll really endeavor to break some new ground here with regard to the content of the book. But very long story short, why I decided to write this at this time, or why I decided to publish these essays first, is that in terms of opening new pathways of thinking and taking a moment to reflect on the trajectory of one's career for the sake of, potential reorientations, new avenues of contemplation, it's always good to go back to the fundamental thinkers and, revisit the backbone of the history of philosophy, which was very much at the core of my work from the start. I mean, the essays that were...
And I do apologize in this much of the video, because Giorgiani, you need to let Giorgiani unpack a few things, and then he will bring it back home, and then he'll tie it back in. But Giorgiani's making a great point here in terms of a lot of the modern philosophy is just garbage. There's no point of even getting a philosophy degree from these places, right? Because primarily you have the what's it called? It's logic philosophy. That's all they care about. It's just logic, and if it's logic and all this kind of shit. And it's sterilized, gray. I'm trying to think of any other words to describe it. It's just think about those square buildings in architecture. It's just undetailed, just straight up raw, and it's ugh. It's basically doing a computer programming class. There's no creativity in it. There's no kind of soul in it, for fuck's sake. Do you know what I mean? Then you have continental philosophy, which is what you could do. Which again, it's kind of shallow in a sense, where it's they only really talk about the surface level of the different philosophers that they cover and all this kind of stuff. Well, at least they do cover, fucking at least Nietzsche, although it's a very kind of surface level. Doesn't actually give you a full kind of comprehension of what actually Nietzsche was all about and the game that he was playing. And again, I'd heavily suggest you check out Jordan Peterson's channel. He just put an introduction into Nietzsche in terms of the shortest way of possibly explaining what Nietzsche was actually up to in terms of he was being the Loki, or he was being the outsider to the Christians, as being a critic on terms of the what would be a good way to describe it? The societal perception in terms of what a quote unquote good Christian is. You need a Nietzsche to stand there as the quote unquote enemy, point these out, and then the society say, no, you're wrong because it actually means this. And whatever way you look at who's actually right in terms of the actual argument, all this kind of stuff, what actually plays out in society is what you want, this kind of renaissance and all this kind of thing. You know what I mean? And this is the whole thing of we're at a fucking period now where the postmodernists are going after the founding fathers, and trying to claim that deists are now atheists, just a complete lie. That's basically all you can really say is they just lie, and without any purpose, without any meaning, which is why they're all fucking nihilist and every single thing. You've seen it there on the Rob Noah debate. would you want society to continue on like women as is, like they have their kids and their mothers and all this kind of stuff, or would you rather them maximize their happiness, but everyone gets sterilized? We don't continue the human race. They'd pick the second one. I was like, rip. That's all they can say. Bloviating. You know what I mean? It's all like a facade, like just like completely fake. You know what I mean? And that's why I genuinely think there's a connectedness between like the beauty and the philosophy, because their philosophy is fake as fuck, and then what you see be produced in society is a bunch of like fake people, like cardiovascular or whatever, clavicle, whatever the fuck the dude's name is, the Lux Maxon cunt, and then these OnlyFans chick, like with the Donald Duck lips. You know what I mean? Like everything is literally fake. You know what I mean? Or at least one thing is at least fake on most of these women, all this kind of shit. Do you know what I mean? An absurd worldview will give you an absurd world. You know what I mean? I was running and the dog bit me on the buttocks. Anyway, that scar came from the end. What the fuck? What is going on in chat? Cardiovascular. Listen, I'm not good with names, okay? And you know that's ironic coming from a cunt called Teriak, but it is what it is. It's a rough life out there, okay? Now you guys, I'm gonna give you guys the same treatment I get, okay? The amount of fucking times I was called teriyaki chicken. Unbelievable. But anyways, let's get back to the video.
Published in this volume, Lovers of Sophia, even though, you know, it was, I believe, the third or fourth of my books to come out in print. They predate Prometheus and Atlas. And so it's very clear how my work proceeded from a deep and in some cases radically unorthodox reading of some of the fundamental thinkers. And that's something that we can get into today as well with regard to the question of the overman or the highest human type and the various ways in which these fundamental thinkers have contributed to crafting an image of that throughout the history of philosophy. Because actually, I would argue that Nietzsche represents less of a break with Plato and Aristotle than a lot of moderns have imagined. And that when Nietzsche is taken to be the sort of inverter of Platonism and, you know, deconstructor of a representational conception of truth based on the mind's relationship to a putatively objective reality, a kind of deconstruction that is then furthered by Heidegger. That view of Nietzsche's role in the history of philosophy and the implications it has for his conception of the Übermensch and the Übermensch's relation to ethos and to orienting values and so forth, that conception is based on misattributing Platonism or a Neoplatonic worldview to Plato and Aristotle. Whereas, in fact, that worldview, with its kind of objective representation of reality, its macrocosm, microcosm relation between the cosmos and the mind, is actually a product of Hellenistic thinking at the time when Christianity arose around, 300, 400 AD, around about the time of Plotinus and thereafter. For reasons that we can get into in some degree of detail, the way I read Plato and Aristotle, again, somewhat heretically, is that their understandings of what counts for developing a more adequate conception of things and for operating based on knowledge rather than being subject to delusions and baseless opinion.
Now, just to give you the 411, because this goes into like Giorgiani is like a magician in terms of like the big words that he uses and all this kind of stuff, and the amount of meaning he can actually squeeze into a short period of time, but you won't understand what the fuck he's saying. unless he actually unpacks and all this kind of shit. But like fundamentally, what Giorgiani is saying here is when he reads Plato, he reads it heretically, meaning he is not, when he reads Plato or when he endorses Plato, he's not saying that he's a Platonist. Okay, when you look at like a Platonist or a Neoplatonist, like they'll have this concept of like the ideal forms, right? Or Plato talks about like this ideal forms, like that the circles that we see in architecture or in buildings and all this kind of stuff. There's actually the perfect circle, and one should orientate itself around making the perfect circle as an architect, engineer, whatever the fuck. Right? Now, question: does Plato actually believe that we could like actually identify precisely exactly what a quote unquote perfect circle is? Does Plato actually believe that exists in the abstract, the mind or the non-physical realm, whatever way you want to put it, right? No, Plato doesn't actually believe that like you can actually create the perfect circle, but you should still orientate yourself towards that if even if you don't believe it. You know what I mean? And this is the whole kind of concept of like you heard Jordan Peterson or Douglas Murray talk about. It's like would people be better off if they believed that a god was watching over them, etc., etc., etc. You get what I'm saying? This like the Platonic form, like Jason Giorgiani would argue that the Platonic forms are a noble lie, but you need that noble lie because it orientates you or grounds you in terms of like aiming for perfection, even though you might not even experience perfection. What even is perfection? Let's go even kind of like more fundamental. Like what do we mean when we say the perfect circle, etc., etc. But if you want to become the greatest at something, you need to have that mindset of that actually is achievable.
Is a lot closer to Nietzsche's own understanding than people give Plato and Aristotle credit for. So anyway, we can go into that. Oh, there you go. You showed up a double for 1 second on my screen, but then now it's corrected.
No worries.
Go ahead.
No worries. Yes. So when it comes to certain people out there, let's say who, speaking of Julius Evola, people who I would say go much further away from your ideal, to say the least, of what the Urmen should be, would be one certain gentleman, Alexander Dugin, who I'm sure you're familiar with when it came to his recent tweet saying, whites, they are destroyed the world and themselves. To be white means to be nihilist. It is self-hatred race. It caused so many troubles to others and to itself. It lost the right to be something. No arguments to support their existence. But then that was followed up after he got, as you know, this big backlash with, I am more white than almost all of you. I am Indo-European, Aryan, and proud of it. You are wrong, Aryans. Liberal, weak, pervert. You are modern. This kind of whiteness is shame. Real whites are Iranians, Indians, Evolians. All the
Indians,
rest is fresh.
The thrash there at the end really takes the cake. Oh, man. Well, as I said on X, and by the way, if anyone's serious about following me, you really have to get on X. X is my principal platform, okay? Everything else is really secondary in terms of where I'm active. But as I said on X, I mean, look, this statement is bad. This is bad. There was another one where he basically said that, we just need to clasp our hands in prayer and adopt Orthodox Christianity and wait for the Lord's grace to descend upon us, as the apocalypse unfolds. And so, between these various statements, one can see that this man never had the constitution of a philosopher. I mean, it's one thing for a poor soul like Bergson, who despite all his brilliance and, the very constructive work that he did, kind of very quietly, very, very quietly converted to Christianity toward the end of his life, to have like a Christian burial and a Christian, a Christian burial, essentially. That's not great, for Bergson to disgrace himself like that before the end of his life. But Dugin has spent now decades basically being an evangelist, a preacher for Orthodox Christianity, and the absolutely ill-considered way in which he is now engaging in racist attacks against white people further underlines the fact that this man has neither the cast of mind nor the ethical constitution to really rightly be considered a philosopher. He is ultimately a glorified propagandist and an evangelist. And, you know, I've been suggesting this for some time now, and I think it's become abundantly clear to people. So, I mean, we can comment on that or analyze in a little more detail if you'd like, although I don't want to give too much, too much oxygen to Dugin. But in short, as I think is pretty clear from my various statements and especially my writings throughout the years, I mean, no higher intellectual activity, including and especially philosophy and the sciences, that derived from out of it in a serious, conceptually grounded way would exist but for white people. And let me tell you, as a fellow Aryan, okay, who has both European heritage, but then also a paternal Iranian heritage. And the Iranians are, of course, the quintessential Aryans. Iranian is simply the Middle Persian form of the ancient Persian word Aryan, okay? Ancient Scythian, ancient Persian word Aryan. That's what the country used to be called, Aryana, and the people called themselves Aryoi. Okay, so as a fellow Aryan, let me tell you that despite the significant contributions that the Iranian branch of the Indo-European family made to philosophy and the sciences and technological development in various periods throughout history, but especially, say, between 900 and 1150 AD, the overwhelming majority of higher intellectual activity and techno-scientific development on this planet owes itself to the European and American branches of the Aryan world. And by the way, this whole notion that, Aryan only refers to the Indo-Aryan.
Bro, just based on like European and American technology alone, like you realize like we have this whole phenomenon with like the African, like the tribal communities that like they doubt that like the even inventors, and then they start making up people saying, oh yeah, like no, this black dude actually invented this, and then you look into like what they were actually invented, and it was like nothing close to what the Europeans and the Americans like were inventing. You know what I mean? Like think of like America alone. You know what I mean? And America's like relatively young, like only a couple of 100 years. And think of like the light bulb, the like just the industrialization alone. You know what I mean? Of like what essentially was the New World. You know what I mean? And not only have you done such massive, great things in those lands, but you've not only like maintained it, which is a key thing. To actually maintain what you got. You know, a lot of like quote unquote making money with cryptocurrency is just being able to look at the mindset of like, I just want to maintain this wealth for as long as possible. You know what I mean? But like that's based in America. Andrew's also improved on it. You know what I mean? The rival of the world. You know? And again, obviously in like European, like that's even like if you want to throw Tesla in being like European, or if you want to throw it in as American, that's up to you. But I mean, like we could turn the whole rest of the stream into like a Tesla show. You know what I mean? Furthermore, like you look at the aspect of like the Europeans as well. You know what I mean? It's one of those things where, like, if we just talk about like the stuff we're talking about like last stream, like the German, like looking back in Germany, especially in that kind of like that time period, just looking at it from like the societal standard, and also like with technology, they were even ahead of the Americans at the time, at least. You know what I mean? Especially we see these light domes flying around at impossible angles and all that kind of shit. You know what I mean? Like it's to make a mockery is one thing, but at one stage you have to kind of like wonder, like, is it genuinely nefarious? which is what Giorgiani basically calls out Dugin for. Because you're either like fucking retarded, or you know what I mean, you're basically just straight up lying about a whole race of people, and then just like being racist through your own race.
Or Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European family is completely fallacious. It's completely fallacious. The word Aryan in ancient Persian and Scythian and the various Iranian languages derives from an older Indo-European term, herios, which the Greeks adapted into heroes. And it was a self-designator for a large group of people who later were understood to be European, including the Celts, who refer also to their country as Erin, which is a cognate of Iran, meaning the Aryan place. Okay.
And if I write out the Irish name, like if you type in Ireland in Irish, it's E-I-R-E-A-N-N. So E-I-R is air, E, which is E, and then A-N-N is Anne, which an English person, or let's say an Anglo-Saxon pronouncing Ireland in the Irish name, would have been Anne. Ariana.
Okay. And so it's a perfectly legitimate reference to the entire, what you could call the white race or Caucasian people or whatever other name you want to give to it. And that.
Aaron, yeah. Aaron. Like even think of like the name Ryan, right? In Irish, that's Rian, right? Which means like Lil King. You know what I mean?
Only went out of fashion after World War II for obvious reasons, because the term was politically appropriated by the Nazis. And, look, a lot of sheepish Iranians like to act as if, the German appropriation of the term Aryan was completely illegitimate and like the Nazis were misappropriating, Iran and whatever. No. Look, you owe the Germans for the science of Iranology. The discipline of Iranology was really grounded by the works of Hegel and the seriousness with which the Germans took Iran as fundamental to progress in human history, rather than seeing Greece necessarily as the inception of a higher civilizational trajectory on the earth. That's reflected in Nietzsche only because from the time of Hegel and even earlier, Germans were recognizing the importance of Iran as the matrix of the Aryan world, and Greece as secondary, and then Rome as tertiary. Okay, so this view of history in modern Europe really begins with the Germans. And so, it's actually, they were honoring Iran by, trying to identify themselves with the ancient Persians and Scythians and so forth, and see that as the wellspring of the civilization that eventually was framed as Western. So, look, be that as it may, this raving Orthodox lunatic, the degree of conceptual confusion in his, in all likelihood, drunken, statements on X is beyond belief.
Do you see it serving the Russian government more than just him wanting to rant about certain things that he enjoys thinking about? Because at the end of the day, the kind of picture that gets created of this global South, third worldist, whatever you want to call it, configuration is one that would unite together Russia, China, certain other third world countries against what they would see as this debaucherous Western civilization that has lost the mandate of heaven, so to speak.
Yeah, obviously. And again, that only reifies the perversity of his attempt to misappropriate the Aryan heritage, because the Russian agenda that Dugin is serving is the subsumption of the white race into an undifferentiated, collectivistic, Asian mass where, Indians, Chinese people especially, and then Russians are all slowly integrated into this traditionalist BRICS order, okay? And the Russians are this like sort of, you know, marginally white element that over time is like melted into, you know, the undifferentiated mass of the Asian quasi-Mongol, you know, BRICS world, right? And that maybe will bring a certain degree of scientific and cultural eccentricity to the BRICS sphere, right? But that won't be guilty of, from a Christian perspective, or from a Chinese, you know, Confucian perspective, the sin or the departure from the mandate of heaven that the Promethean aspirations and, you know, enterprising force of discovery and innovation represents in, you know, the West, right? So everything about the West that ultimately led to artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, but also to parapsychology, and that lies behind the Western ambition to explore not just space, but also time as, you know, a frontier for the expansion of human consciousness. All of that is interpreted as somehow satanic or counter-traditional or at odds with the mandate of heaven from this, you know, Asiatic perspective that Dugin wants to subsume Aryan identity under, okay? So it's a fundamental betrayal of the Promethean spirit of the Aryan peoples. And one of the things that you see, now we're getting a little bit far from fundamental thinkers, but not entirely, in a way that I can bring it back. One of the things that you see throughout my entire corpus is an insistence on the Promethean interpretation of the Aryan heritage. In other words, Dugin with his, oh, the Indians are the real Aryans and all this. Hinduism in its basic structure, especially as reflected in the form of sociopolitical organization that it leads to, minus this little experiment with democracy since the British left India, okay? Hinduism in its basic structure, in other words, you know, the Vedic, Vedantic tradition is in its essential form no different from any other hierarchical, paternalistic, Asiatic social organization. So on a deeper level, India can be very easily integrated into a single world order with China and with a Russia that embraces the most paternalistic Orthodox interpretation of Christianity. Okay, again, the same interpretation of Christianity that was responsible for Hypatia of Alexandria literally being skinned alive and burned at the stake by Kirill, their own bishop and saint.
The same name, by the way, that's shared by the current head of the Russian Orthodox Church as well. But one caveat I wanted to add is that if you look at the breeding program, for lack of a better term, back in the day that the Mongols instituted in medieval Muscovy, it had to do with not like mixing of different peoples, but it was just this breeding of Russians, which was not a course towards any kind of progression in the good sense. These are people that were kept completely away from any kind of literature, any kind of knowledge. And I think that regardless of, you know, whatever people may say about DNA or genetics, I could see the genetics lowering themselves based on how little of a quality civilization they had there. So you did end up having, obviously, outliers like Chekhov. You know, he came from a family of Russian serfs. But I think that the pull downwards was so strong for so many people that, you know, you don't need to talk about, well, if the Chinese and the Russians combine together into this permanent serf class, you know, then Dugin's mission will be complete. I would say it was complete long before that, just with the Russians themselves, which brings me back to Nietzsche and his idea of the master race.
Let me
where-
not get
yeah.
sidetracked though, Lev, before we
Sure.
go there. Okay, the point
Mhm.
that I was trying to make, and I agree with you, by the way. And unfortunately, to a certain extent, a similar thing was done by the Mongols in Iran that led to a protracted decline of Iranian civilization. But the point that I was trying to make is this:
Mhm.
that you're a moron to take Hindu India as representative of the Aryan. And a lot of right-wing Europeans have a tendency to do this. To the extent they engage with India at all, it's the Vedic system because they like the caste organization of society, right? And they also feel like, they will be sort of revered as, basically supermen, by the native Indian population. And lamentably, a large number of Indians actually who were nationalists and against British colonialism practically, worshipped Hitler and some of his Nazi associates. They saw him as a kind of Kalki avatar. So you tend to have this emphasis of India, whereas this is completely retarded and perverse insofar as what it is that makes the Aryan heritage distinct and radically different from all of the other cultures on the planet is precisely the breaking with a paternalistic, hierarchical, unquestioned, primordial conception of tradition and the cyclical view of time that goes along with it, where there's a golden age, silver age, a bronze age, a decline of the ages leading ultimately to the Kali Yuga, and then back again to the Satya Yuga or the golden age, right? Where the gods have to come down and reestablish order on the earth from out of chaos. What makes the Aryan heritage different from that cyclical conception of time and that hierarchical, unquestioned traditionalist ordering of society that's common to every other culture on the planet is precisely the idea of progress and the willingness to deconstruct tradition and open up the space for creativity and innovation, creativity in the arts and literature and, scientific and technological discovery and innovation, okay? And of course, all of the thinkers who are covered in this book, going back to Heraclitus, represent the backbone in that historical trajectory. So Dugin is ridiculous. I mean, he's ridiculous. Like, this is precisely what constitutes the genius of the Aryan world. This progressive lineage, not to call it a tradition, this, future-oriented trajectory.
And like, to give an example of what Giorgiani means right here, like this, like Promethean spirit, what he talks about, is like, that's like that whole like American thing of like what happened in Venezuela. You know what I mean? Like this whole aspect of like, who the fuck's gonna stop me? Like that whole kind of spirit, when something wrong is being done, you want an American by your side. And like that kind of like is a key way to identify Americans. This is America. The whole like Team America thing. It's like when they show up, it's the Americans. Like in Iran, they knew America was fucking had the boats on the thing when all those explosions starts happening. You know what I mean? So it's like this whole kind of like aspect of you're not going to get through life by just trying to follow some sort of set guidelines or rules. Inevitably, you're going to have to bend a rule here or there to get shit done in the long run. Right? And in terms of like I think Jordan Peterson tried to phrase it in the language of like the minimum necessary force. You know what I mean? But when that point is crossed, or that line is the Rubicon is crossed, to give an American example, like Americans are definitely people I want on my side. Canadians too, because holy shit, like Canadians when they go to war, they don't fuck around. Like I said, it's kind of like like when you look at like from America to Iran, like Aryan. You know what I mean? and it encapsulates like so many different kind of, like, if you want to say, oh, like, well, you know, the Italians are are like, or Italian is a Romance language, meaning like it's Roman, you know. Same with French, same with Spanish, Portuguese. You know what I mean? Like that, they're like known as the Romances. Whereas like you look at the Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, all this kind of shit. Fundamentally, it's all overarching in terms of the same kind of perspective. So when they say like, oh, like the black community, the opposite side isn't necessarily the white community; it's the Aryan community. You know what I mean?
Which began with Plato's absolutely heretical, just like radically counter-traditional suggestion that philosophers should redesign the religion that the majority of people in society adhere to.
Shante, I'm staying out of it, because apparently if I get involved, then the shit going down. You know what I'm saying? I'm pulling the Johnny Depp here.
I'm scared to death. I'm frightened and I don't know what to do. I'm confused and I want to go home.
You know what I'm saying? I'm trying to philosophize here. Like I said, Shante, you gotta learn eventually. You know what I'm saying? Give them a bit of hate. You know what I'm saying? Tell them to go fuck themselves. Call them a bunch of cunts. You know what I'm saying? But be creative about it. You know what I'm saying?
That basic institutions like patriarchy should be questioned, and women should be given an opportunity to cultivate themselves as individuals in all areas of human endeavor, right? I mean, Plato's thinking in some ways is radically counter-traditional precisely insofar as it's able to open up possibilities for what ultimately becomes techno-scientific development, including social engineering, which reaches its peak in a project like the positivism of Auguste Comte, right? But whether it's Plato or whether it's Aristotle, also nearly being executed by the Athenians because he was like writing the constitutions of various city-states on contract, you know, which showed how little naive or blind allegiance he had to any political order, and how far above the demos he saw himself and his fellow social planners.
And good point, Shante. That's why I'd like to thank this show sponsor.
From doctors, nurses, and pharmacists to moms, dads, and caregivers, they have all put their trust in Tylenol.
Please be patient. My mom took Tylenol. But where was a teeth, a gum protector? Right,
in their capacity to adjust the constitution of different city-states based on their cultural proclivities into a form that would allow those particular people to have a more constructive relationship to fundamental virtues and principles that would be conducive to the cultivation of the human person, right? That kind of dynamic, cross-cultural thinking deeply scared the Athenians. And
as it should.
Yes, and so you see this throughout the history of philosophy, and ultimately, you know, it culminates in figures like Nietzsche and Heidegger, which, you know, as you are about to delve into, are presenting us with an image of, in the case of Heidegger, a fundamental threat to the boundary conditions of human existence on the part of the world in framing power of technological science. And in the case of Nietzsche, a vision of what kind of transformation and further evolution of humanity would be adequate to a successful navigation of that challenge, right? And our ability to transit into what Nietzsche calls a higher history, and what Hegel would have seen as the end of merely human history, right? This is an eschatological vision, a kind of progressive teleology that somebody like Dugin has to reject entirely as satanic and anathema to any divinely sanctified, properly ordered world, which effectively means that this charlatan ideologue has to throw, the baby of philosophy out with the bathwater of its history, leaving him, as a, some kind of naked Orthodox monk in a drained out tub. All right. So this is where we're at with him and with all of the, rather retarded, aimless, lost young people who are grasping onto somebody as impoverished as Dugin as a source of meaning, in this time when we're facing such urgent challenges, and where the imaginative capacity to think outside the box and to be able to see innovative solutions is more important than ever.
Well, it is called the retard right for a reason. That's the new term that's been gaining popularity recently among people, not just Dugin, but people like Nick Fuentes or Sneeko or, Candace Owens, people of that sort, kind of the bread and circus people, Dave Smith. But the issue for me comes in when we're talking about something like the Overman. If we're seeing the sheer amount of people that are being attracted to these kind of idiotic ideologues, then the concern is, will there be this kind of, I know I'm kind of pushing forward a bit here, but this is a very, I think, important thing for us to tackle, this bifurcation that Nietzsche talked about when it comes to there being the Overman and then there being the last man. It just seems like the amount of distraction that I think a lot of people, including a lot of smart people, find themselves to be in because, back then in the golden age of Greece and Rome, they didn't have smartphones to distract themselves with, all of these great philosophers. So the concern here is that how much is it going to be, as you and Nietzsche were talking about, this bifurcation of this Overman who is able to resist all of these creature comforts versus there being this kind of, this kind of personality who's ruthless, charismatic, clever, and disciplined enough to game the system, but at the same time, they're still fundamentally enslaved to these kind of distracted desires that our smartphones and various other tech is going to bring.
Okay, so it's a very complex question. Philosophy arose historically in opposition to two different types of person. One was the unreflective, common man, blindly moved by baseless opinions. Okay? And this human type was a particularly serious problem in the society in which philosophy really crystallized, namely classical Athens, because it was a democracy. And so since the common man had exceptionally significant power in this society, it was, all the more an acute problem that the majority were basing incredibly important decisions, not only in their personal lives, but in terms of the life of the city-state, on baseless and unexamined opinions. So that's
retard supremacy, basically. You know what I mean? Athens was a full-blown democracy, absolute shithole.
one type of person that Plato has his dramatic persona of Socrates ceaselessly questioning throughout his dialogues. The other type, though, is the sophist, who's an incredibly sophisticated, shrewd, analytically competent person, capable of crafting charismatically compelling arguments for any and all cases when it's useful and when the sophist is being paid enough, like a lawyer would be paid, right? To come up with that kind of oration for, any number of bad actors in society, whether it's corrupt politicians or merchants who want various mercantile policies changed or whatever, right? And unfortunately, 2,500 years later, we're still dealing with both of these types, right? I mean, it goes without mention that the vast majority of people, especially since the collapse of our modern educational system, which has collapsed in terms of its integrity, in terms of its being based on the canon, in terms of its, analytical rigor, it has effectively collapsed in the last few decades. So especially after the collapse of the modern educational system into postmodern relativism and cultural relativism and identity politics and so on and so forth, we're obviously still dealing with the first type where, 95% of people, at least in society, if not 99%, are completely aimless, deluded. I hesitate even to say individuals for reasons that we'll come to when we talk about Heidegger and his very legitimate conception of das Mann, or the they, the inauthentic, undifferentiated mass of people. So this mass still leads its life based on unjustified and not properly examined opinions. And then we're still dealing with the sophists, where when you hear that Palantir has a manifesto now, or there's like an Anduril manifesto or whatever, there are evidently so-called philosophers, which I hear are particularly influenced by Machiavelli, big surprise there, right? Working in the think tanks of companies for Peter Thiel and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and so forth, coming up with effectively sophistical arguments to justify corporate policies, right? And, corporatist agendas. So we're still dealing with those two types. And your question is whether the concrete conditions that could lead to the enhancement of a subset of mankind into effectively a new race of supermen, and thereby also an artificial speciation of humanity into, on the one hand, superhumans, and on the other hand, subhumans, increasingly dehumanized, increasingly inhuman, people, that effectively are used as tools by the...
And the Chinese, ladies and gentlemen, will call this Bai Zhao. Bai Zhao. So a citizen, it's an insult for those who can only care about topics such as immigration, minorities, LGBT, and environment, have no sense of real problems in the world. They are hypocritical humanitarians who advocate for peace and equality only, satisfy their own feeling of moral superiority, but then they'll also claim that morality is relative and all this kind of bullshit. They are obsessed with political correctness to the extent that they tolerate backwards Islamic values for the sake of multiculturalism. They believe in the welfare state that benefits only the idle and the free riders. They are the ignorant and arrogant Westerners who pity the rest of the world and think that they are survivors. You know what I mean? It is what it is.
Superman. Whether this, whether the concrete conditions, the various tools and techniques that would facilitate that transformation are going to be misused by the kind of Machiavellian sophists of our time to establish an oligarchical elite, is effectively what you could call it, an oligarchical elite that would exploit the rest of humanity, or whether, some more fundamental psychological and spiritual transformation can really take place that would make more ethical and constructive use of these technologies. You wanted to add something to what you were saying?
I just want to make sure, and I think you understand where I'm coming from here. I'm putting into question the very idea that a Superman is able to come about in this kind of state, as opposed to whoever would be designated the Superman would just be a slightly more intelligent, more cunning version of whatever we're left with just because of this gravitational force of technological distraction. That in order to have somebody that would be so disciplined, and again, like, I don't know, that's why I was talking about back then, during those ancient times, sure, they had bread and circuses, but they didn't have the ability to generate pretty much whatever you want to on your phone using AI. So I don't know.
So Plato defines the project of philosophy against both of these human types, okay? And he effectively argues that society needs to be reorganized in such a way that oligarchs cannot use sophists to manipulate masses who deal only in baseless opinions, right? So that an educational system and a political structure needs to be crafted that will allow people who are fundamentally driven by the desire for discovery and by the will to higher intellectual comprehension, including comprehension of the right form of society for the maximal cultivation of the human person, right? So the social order would be reorganized in a way where those individuals could provide guidance to the masses through a well-structured educational system and meritocratically afford each individual the capacity to cultivate their own potential to the greatest extent possible, right? And a political order that's going to forcibly constrain the personality types that would otherwise tyrannize over society in the form of an oligarchy. And the kinds of proposals that Plato puts forward for that, which again, I summarize in, Fundamental Thinkers, they are extremely radical, okay? Like, for example, no one but the philosophical class and the auxiliaries, are basically stormtroopers, who serve the purposes of the philosophers, are allowed to possess weaponry. So there's no general right to bear arms in this society. By contrast, or rather on the inverse of that, the oligarchs aren't allowed to basically, build up arms depots on their personal property. Like, the vast majority of the population of the United States holds currently more weaponry than the US military. There are so many, frankly, rednecks and hillbillies in this country who, with their, subscriptions to Guns and Ammo and their, local shooting shops, have amassed armories of all kinds of automatic weapons and, massive arsenals, okay? That could be used against the state, or that could be used to create a new state in a condition of out of a condition of chaos. So Plato in Republic says that you can't have this, okay? You can't, because, it's one thing when it's rednecks and hillbillies. It's another thing when it's Peter Thiel and Palantir. And you can have basically corporate feudal states arise that are more powerful than the nominal government, and that then can tyrannize over the population, right? And so in his ideal vision of society, weapons are kept out of the hands of the people who would become oligarchs, or who would set up a tyrannical kingship, or whatever other system. And by the way, he thinks that democracy will always, in effect, be an oligarchy, because he thinks that the mob can be effectively, easily manipulated by oligarchs through, sophists and people who are capable of crafting various forms of sophistry to manipulate the masses. You were going to say something.
I want to rewind it a little bit, though, because
And what he's getting on here, with Peter Thiel, is you think of Peter Thiel as an individual, but when you think of giving access, allowing business to get to the point where they could make these robots and all this kind of stuff, and just rig them with some machinery, some weaponry, and then all of a sudden you have a situation where on a whim, one individual like basically as like a robot army. Do you know what I mean? In terms of like First Amendment, that's kind of like an aspect where or like another aspect is like the drone. We've all seen like the drone warfare. Probably that's a better example to use. Like giving access to that to like just any random private citizen who has enough money, all of a sudden that turns into what Giorgiani's describing as like some sort of like feudal monarchy. You know what I mean? This is why, like I said, I got a debate coming up on the 19th, hosted by my boy Speakeasy, like kind of addressing this kind of whole concept of like there are certain things where like the government does need to step in, certain areas where the government does need to step in, and at the end of the day, it comes down to protecting the nation in order to do that. Because again, if that falls down to one dude, you basically just have the same situation I would describe with the oligarchy. But I digress.
Because what I think also has to be paid attention to, the primary thing here, the unmoved mover, so to speak, of instituting these kind of programs is still someone who, let's say, would be the proto-Ubermensch that would have to resist all of the seductions of creature comforts, of technology, of AI, of whatever thing enables people to, let's say, doom scroll. And I don't know about yourself, but I'm sure that there are a lot of very intelligent people out there that have succumbed to the kind of things with technology like doom scrolling, for instance, that they're aware they shouldn't do at the same time they've been caught. So what you're saying would require such a radical departure from that. My concern is that who we're going to be left with, even if they're smart people, are still going to have that part of their will succumbing to these kind of things.
Yeah, let's get there. I fully see this is where you want to go, and we'll get there, okay, step by step. So I just want to give a few more examples. So arms are kept out of the possession of oligarchs, and at the same time, the philosopher rulers are prohibited from having personal bank accounts or amassing individual wealth. So those who have the sovereign authority to govern society and have a class of essentially knights bound to their service, they are not allowed to amass private wealth or personal property. They have to live effectively a communistic life. And this extends to not having nuclear families because nepotism is an obvious source of corruption. And if you're more loyal to your family than you are to the welfare of the state, well, that by itself, is unjust and is going to, lead to, various social problems. So his proposals are extremely radical in a text like Republic. Then when you look at Auguste Comte, Comte criticizes Plato's proposals in all kinds of specific ways. But if you step back and look at the big picture of the form of social organization that he's proposing for his positivist society and the type of human person that would constitute the sociocratic leadership that essentially he sees as a secular priesthood for this, progressive social order, it's ultimately the same as what Plato is aspiring towards. Okay? I mean, again, this is a question of being able to see a similarity of form despite a difference of content. There are lots of specific differences in the proposals. Some of them are very significant, like, for example, when it comes to the proper role of women in society, or exactly what role the philosopher, ruler, or to put it in Comte's terms, the sociocratic leader, exactly what role this type of person will have with respect to the state, where in Plato's case, the guardians are literally the sovereigns of the state. And in Comte's case, he says, no, actually, they should be a moral power that is legally separate from the state, so that ultimately its authority exceeds the authority of the state, and that it's not corrupted by state power defined narrowly and technically, right? There are these specific differences. Mm-hmm. But the type of person that Comte is outlining here in his vision of the positivist society is ultimately the same super intellectual. I'll use the word altruistic because Comte coined the term. Auguste Comte coined the term altruism to refer to a kind of selflessness or self-overcoming where all of those petty desires that produce a tyrant in the form of the old oligarchy that Plato was already interested in resisting are overcome in the context of one's persona by the compelling power of one's perception of the beautiful and by one's deep desire for higher intellectual cultivation and by the satisfaction that one gets from the beauty of a justly ordered society and so forth, right? Like these are the facets of the persona of the leader in both Comte's system and Plato's, despite the specific differences. And I think that when you look at what Georg Hegel envisions as the end of history, insofar as that end of history, the end of the historical process of progress, produces a particular human type that's characterized by the freedom from unconscious adherence to various dialectical forces and what Hegel calls absolute self-consciousness of the human person with regard to all the factors that can condition our thought individually and our behavior on a social level. Comte's ideal conception of the human being and Plato's are very much resonant with what Hegel imagined as the fully actualized human potential at the end of history. But the interesting question to really try to get at where you want to take us is whether Hegel was wrong about the master-slave dialectic, because part of Hegel's argument for how the various changes in the basic frameworks of knowledge and the fundamental principles of social organization will eventually resolve themselves, right? How various successive political revolutions and paradigm shifts in the sciences will eventually converge on this society constituted by free and self-conscious individuals. A very integral element of that is Hegel's argument that such an end of history would be a full overcoming of what he calls the master-slave dialectic, which is the idea that in various successive stages of history, the power differential between people who are in a position of mastery, who are overlords, who are in command and control, versus those who they exploit and who are subservient to them, this power differential represents an alienation of consciousness in the individual human person.
And I think what Giorgiani doesn't apply here is the what the fuck's it called? The Hegelian dialectic, where it's not necessarily where it's like you either be the master or the servant. You are a servant master. You know what I mean? Like this whole aspect of the paradox being critical, I'd argue, like to an essence of understanding philosophy. Because again, like I'd refer to use all to the song Bittersweet Symphony.
That the masters in a society, whether they're ancient Greek tyrants or whether they're medieval feudal lords or whether they're modern corporate oligarchs or whatever form they take in particular, those people are enslaved themselves insofar as their unconscious and exploitative relationship toward the people who they've enslaved or who they're exploiting expresses a kind of psychological alienation which they themselves on an individual level have not yet been able to overcome.
And this is why it like what Giorgiani says here in terms of like the oligarchs or the kings, like whatever you want to call it, whatever kind of system you want to put in place, like this aspect of power becomes corrupted by this kind of like whatever enslavement it is. So like think of like the amount of like blackmail that Jeffrey Epstein had, the fact that was such a big hot flash kind of moment to realize is like blackmailers, just by having access to certain information on the right kinds of people, they can start bending societies and all this kind of shit to their will. So think of like the fuck's his name, Prince Andrew, I think it is, like that whole spiel in terms of like the royal family being affected by it and all this kind of shit. So like how many decisions were forced upon them based on that information and all this kind of shit. But long story short, a key aspect to this is if you are a slave to reason, if the masters enslave themselves to the reason, then like I said, it works out. You get an aristocracy.
And this is where Marx's whole communist project develops from out of Hegel, where Marx proposes that the only form of society that's capable of, fundamentally and comprehensively overcoming that alienation is communism. Okay, that was not Hegel's own solution. In any case, Nietzsche is proposing something diametrically at odds with the direction in which Marx takes Hegel. Namely, that the master-slave dialectic cannot be ultimately resolved in the way that Hegel imagined it would be, because the further evolution of humanity into a kind of superhuman that in some instances Nietzsche says would be as different from man as man is from the ape, that further evolution of humanity creates a form of life which is so self-justifying and in lack of and lacking in need of a recognition from anyone else, that by the same token, it's no longer in a reciprocal relationship with anything beneath it. On the contrary, the subhumans who fail to make that evolutionary transition become so thoroughly dehumanized that they effectively are enmeshed in the machinery of production and turned into robots that serve the purposes of the Übermenschen, who are the completion of the full actualization of the human potential. Okay, so look, to make this concrete, you can look at it in terms of singularity level technologies. And I think that there are passages, I argue, in Fundamental Thinkers, I quote some of these passages, that Nietzsche is already foreseeing this, and his conception of the speciation of humanity, the bifurcation of mankind, and the rise of the Übermensch in one direction, and the transformation of subhumans into part of the machinery of production in the other direction, is very much anticipating the concrete possibilities of the technological singularity, right? So, for example, once you have people who are genetically engineered to remove all hereditary diseases and defects, they've been gene edited to maximize their IQ and their the ease with which they can develop their physiques, and the various human capacities like sight and hearing and so forth have also been genetically maximized. And then maybe you even have a certain degree of integration of cybernetic components into these individuals to make them even more resilient to environmental conditions and make them even more physically capable under various adverse conditions. That Superman is no longer going to need a worker class to serve its purposes. It's no longer going to need to tyrannize over and exploit relatively less fortunate members of the same society. Rather, for all of those purposes that don't involve creative reflection and, dynamically innovative insight and so forth. We just manufacture a race of robots to carry on, repetitive labor in an autonomous manner. And, those could be robots that look nothing like people. I mean, they could be.
And that's basically the rub. Essentially, what you're getting at here is that, like, equally, like, if you take away the oligarch from having like these killer robots with like just weaponry attached, all this kind of shit, you also take away like that aspect of like certain individuals that would literally like would have their robots take care of like the elderly, all this kind of shit. Do you know what I mean? And either way you look at it, it would effectively wipe out large sectors of the current job market, which would be a massive blow to let's say the or a massive shock, at least in terms of the economy, because you never really can tell which way it goes.
Automatized factories, automatized delivery systems of the kind that we're seeing.
You remember that, right?
And or they could be, humanoid robots. But in any case, there's no need for an underclass. And so there's no need for the Übermenschen to have the kind of psychological recognition that Hegel thinks that the master needs from the slave, and that Marx argued can only come about through the collapse of the master-slave dialectic in the utopian communist society of the future, right? And so this now brings us closer to the core of your question, which is that given the way that various advancing technologies are being used in our approach toward the singularity, as we kind of enter the event horizon of the singularity, given the manner in which artificial intelligence, social media, ubiquitous communication, the capacity for, seamless, flawless simulacra of all kinds to provide us with endless diversions and distractions, and the mediation of all communication to the point where, it's impossible to discern the authenticity of a representation, right? Given the ways in which all of these technologies are being degeneratively deployed, right? What kind of elite is going to ultimately consolidate control over this maelstrom of technological development as the masses are dehumanized to the point where either they become robots themselves through Neuralink and cybernetic integration, or they're simply replaced by, a race of robots because they become an extraneous workforce, right? Or let's say, you plug them all into the matrix because they're biomass that's useless, as Henry Kissinger put it, useless eaters, and just stick them all into the pods. You use them as batteries while they're submersed into a, cybernetically submersed into a virtual landscape. So there are all these extremely dystopian outcomes that we could imagine, none of which are what Nietzsche was getting at when he envisioned what he called aristocracy of the future, a class of higher men that eventually evolves into the overman, which is radically different from mankind. What Nietzsche's envisioning, when you look at his ethical descriptors of the Übermensch, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or the Genealogy of Morals, or the Gay Science, and so forth, when you look at the various ethical characteristics of the Übermensch in terms of boundless intellectual curiosity, just insatiable will to artistic creation, and nobility of spirit, right? To the degree that somebody is impeccably honorable, right? When you look at all these various psychological characteristics of the Overman as Nietzsche conceives of him, you can see that very much it is on a continuum with the Comtean sociocrats and the philosopher guardians envisioned by Plato in Republic. And it is diametrically at odds with the kind of degeneration even of the elite into, tyrants whose most base impulses have been empowered by singularity level technologies and who...
And like the Nordics.
Right. So the idea that we could wind up in a tyranny where shrewd but sadistic overlords use technology that could positively transform us in all kinds of superhuman ways to actually ingratiate themselves and indulge their own worst impulses at the expense of everyone else who is ensconced into the most unbreakable, flawless machinery of enslavement that one can imagine, right? That is a very real possibility that is actually on the immediate horizon for us. And a great deal of my philosophical project has ultimately aimed at addressing that. So, yeah, the question then becomes how, given the constraints, the time constraints, and the various constraints of social crises and, the difficulty of reshaping power structures and having concrete political influence, how do we avert that, ultimately dystopian outcome that is staring us in the face right now?
And I would also add, not just...
And then, like I said, I repeat, like this whole aspect of think about like robotics and advanced AIs. Private oligarchs have access to that level, and it's a Second Amendment. You know what I mean? That's where it's kind of like the interpretation is key, because anytime you're trying to set like some rules or some lines in the sand, fuck, I can't even speak. It's very difficult to think on like the timeless level, particularly when you're talking about like interpretation.
Averting the potential tyrants, but even averting the potential for certain beings that could have otherwise been great Ubermensch type leaders from just succumbing to never coming out of their room, from just succumbing to enjoying, the kind of Apollonian pleasures, if you will, that AI would be able to bestow upon people, as opposed to actually making something of themselves. I also don't want to discount that aspect of it as well. And I'm just thinking, what could be a proper kind of disciplinary action that could be done for people whose potential is seen, so that they don't end up wasting that potential?
Well, Nietzsche says something extremely harsh in this regard. And that's that, and I quote it in Fundamental Thinkers, that's that the same conditions that will lead to the degeneration and atrophy of the vast majority of people will act as a breeding agent that differentiates the type of the higher man and affords him the opportunity to distinguish himself. In other words, those who succumb are undeserving. And the progenitors of the Superman will be revealed precisely in their endurance in the face of the greatest danger. And this idea is in Heidegger also, that the saving power grows amidst the greatest danger when faced with the world-encompassing and instrumentalizing force of modern technology.
Like an example of what like Giorgiani could be talking about here is like, what if, or imagine like what would be like greatest dangers? It would be when your own like government or system is being used or weaponized against you, right? Like, are you going to succumb to it? And like the whole aspect of like succumbing to it, it can be many different things. Are you going to be one of the dudes that just sits in his room all day with the headset on and just jerks himself like the Coomer pods that Andrew talks about? Are you going to be one of these guys that just like goes like sees red kind of thing and starts like just kind of like lashing out without like just having like pure chaos without any order or structure to it? Or you're going to be one of these individuals that just never just black pills and just like brings himself down, all this kind of shit. It's no point, and then self deletes. That's the aspect that we see in front of us. This is the call to adventure that like Jordan Peterson would be pointing out to. You know what I mean? And how do we go forth into the future without, like I said, kind of like pointing out that if it descends into civil war, you weaken yourself to outside forces. So yes, we have a retard problem, but it's a very difficult solution to address.
Heidegger also has this idea that as we reach that apocalyptic moment when the entire world could be inframed and enmeshed by technological science, and what we had taken to be the human essence is itself in danger of being instrumentalized, it is precisely in that moment that there is the potential for a new relationship to the highest possibility of human existence to show itself. And I think that that's true. Now, what form it takes politically is another story. And whatever form that is, it's not going to be democratic. And this brings us back to another theme that runs throughout the history of philosophy. I mean, you look at every one of these great white men, talk about a politically incorrect
old
cover.
white men, yeah.
Old great white men, right? Not dead. They're not, none of them are dead though, in any real sense. And every single one of them is an enemy of democracy. Every single one, without exception. We start with Heraclitus. This guy, when his fellow Ephesians staged a democratic revolt against the satrap Hermodorus, who was governing Ephesus on behalf of the Persian Empire, said that all of his fellow countrymen should be hanged to the last man, and the city should be left to the children, which is consonant with Plato arguing in Republic that in order to implement his ideal educational system and reconstruct the state on the basis of it, everyone over the age of 15 needs to go bye-bye. He doesn't explain where they're going to go bye-bye. It's like that Twilight Zone episode where there's that boy who can wish people into the cornfield.
Yeah.
Right?
By the way, a close friend of mine, James Sheldon, back before he died, he directed that episode. I just happened to meet the director of that particular Twilight episode. Interesting guy. Like, he was a bisexual man who, again, like back in the 1940s, 50s, you wouldn't really expect something like that to be in effect. But apparently, and I don't want to derail this conversation talking about this guy, but I do think it's important to say that he did talk about how sexually open the 1950s was in comparison to what we think. Like, I don't know exactly what that says, but I do think that there was that bit of individualism going on back then at a time when you would expect people to be stuffy. Meanwhile, today it seems like the opposite. Like, there's a lot of pornographic things out there, but as far as the individual will to, be free, it seems to be less so.
I agree. I'm not surprised, though, in this particular case, because Rod Serling was an incredibly progressive person, who, by the way, was Jesse Michaels' uncle.
Wow.
American Alchemy. Jesse Michaels, I believe his uncle was Rod Serling. And he was a very progressive guy. So that he would have this person working, as under him as a director for one of the episodes doesn't surprise me. Anyway, but to go back to the point, which is not entirely unrelated to what you're raising about sexuality, every one of these thinkers is just radically anti-democratic. Why? Because, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Carl Schmitt very effectively argue in their respective works, every properly democratic society has to be bound together by the traditional unquestioned values of that particular people. And that's why democracies only work when they're relatively homogeneous and based on a particular national heritage or religious ideology. So, for example, you also see that very effective democracies can cohere around some relatively conservative, zealous form of religious belief, which is why Islamic democracies are entirely possible, okay? They're just absolutely inimical to individual rights, including the rights of half the human population, namely women, right? But democracies tend to be conservative, and they need what Rousseau calls a civic religion to bind them together. And this is precisely what Socrates and or Plato questioned from the foundation of philosophy onward. Namely, the civic religion of Athens is what Socrates was executed for questioning. And then you got Plato, again, like I said at the outset, proposing that philosophers redesign the religion of the whole society, right? Well, that's not democratic, okay, to say the least. And the thing is that this is still true. And the reason why America is so dysfunctional is that it's trying to combine democracy with what is actually a radically different form of government, namely a republic based on the protection of individual liberties as they have been determined by philosophers. Okay? So
anybody who's telling you that the founding fathers were atheists or all this kind of shit, complete retards, right? But fundamentally, like this kind of like tension that you see between like the Constitution and then the like democracy, as we've discussed ad nauseum here, is that like democracy is essentially retard supremacy. But the founding fathers put in place a republic, aka having a constitution, to hopefully hold the majority in line, because a simple example to expose how retarded democracy is, if 3 out of 4 people want to gang rape the 4th person, that's democratic. You know what I mean? It is what it is. So that's why I genuinely question whether or not like the elections are free and fair, and whether or not that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. Because if it was put in place that Donald Trump didn't get in 2020 election because it was rigged, and pretty much every single election's been rigged since, and before then for a long time, you would then say that, well, Trump was put in 2016 and then taken out and then put back in. So how does that work? Unless the system itself is already rigged and they needed Trump, let's say the businessman, to get the shit done in China and all this kind of shit. Food for thought, as they say.
Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and company were basing their constitutional order on philosophical arguments about what is conducive for the development of the human individual, philosophical arguments crafted by fellow founders like Tom Paine and by more fundamental European Enlightenment thinkers that, these gentlemen had on their desks when they were penning the, grounding documents of this country. That kind of system based on inalienable rights that cannot be voted away by a majority, no matter how large, is not a democracy. And the attempt to intermesh it and synthesize it with democracy is completely misguided and destined to, to face its eventual demise. And we're seeing that right now. So to the extent that America can remain democratic, it will be by transforming America into a Christian theocracy. And there's a very clear attempt to do this right now. I mean, it is, you have to be blind not to see how the UFO disclosure discussion, which is the most important political discussion taking place right now, is being entirely dominated by a Christian fundamentalist discourse, whether it's evangelical or whether it's trad Catholic, and by the way, consonant with orthodoxy as well. This is definitely a machination being deployed by people who want to transform America into a theocracy. And we're already trying to do so in the George W. Bush administration, where W and Condoleezza Rice and so forth used to get together every day, every morning for prayer breakfasts and so forth.
Would you
have
say that
powerful
they
groups
were?
like the Collins elite behind that? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no problem. Would you say that the George W. group with Condoleezza Rice and so on, would you say they were true believers or they were phoning it in for the sake of this great?
Now, bear in mind, like, what Georgiani's like trying to point out here is like Tucker Carlson, for example. You know what I mean? Because if you, and it's very difficult to tell, it's hard to tell sometimes, but if you're able to get to the key question of, like, when they're talking about God, are they talking about reason? Or if they prove God with reason, then there's a possibility. Because the atheists are gone. You can't even get to reason with an atheist. Which is why, essentially, all you're doing is arguing with a tyrant. But if you can get to reason, that's universal, baby.
Greater agenda.
I think some of them were true believers who were being manipulated, and others of them were extremely cynical. And where it becomes really disturbing is in a figure like Dick Cheney, because it's recently come to light through testimony of David Grush and other insiders involved in the UFO so-called disclosure discussion, that Dick Cheney, before, up to the time that he died, was at least a member of the organization conventionally termed Majestic, MJ-12, the highest level, scientifically and technically competent policymaking group with regard to the UFO subject. And this group is at odds with the Collins elite. The Collins elite are Christian theocrats who believe that the Majestic group and their military, industrial, technical apparatus are in league with Satan, and who are effectively engaging in liaisons with demons for the sake of empowering the United States with, exotic technology. So the idea that Dick Cheney, as a member of Majestic, would be involved in a political administration that's full of evangelical Christians and, other religious fundamentalists. I believe FBI Mueller was a member of Opus Dei, so there's Tradcaths involved in this as well. There are Tradcaths, by the way, who also made it to high levels of the CIA, who belong to organizations like the Knights of Malta and the Jesuit Order. But, Dick Cheney's involvement with these individuals is very peculiar because they seem to be on opposite sides of this struggle. Now, it gives me no consolation that someone like Dick Cheney is opposing the theocrats insofar as he's a member of Majestic. This is like being really between between Iraq and a hard place, literally, right? It was Dick Cheney's company Halliburton that took us to Iraq, so that they could enrich themselves like the oligarchs that they are. So this is not very reassuring. And then, you look at something like the abduction of General McCaslin, Neil McCaslin, who was also a member of Majestic, and who, unlike Dick Cheney, seemed like a much more noble-minded person who had very genuine intellectual interests and, wanted some greater degree of transparency on the UFO subject, whether we want to call that disclosure or not, to proceed in a way that was actually enlightening people and raising their level of understanding, right? When you look at something like the abduction of this gentleman, it's cause for a tremendous degree of concern where we're headed in this country, right? Especially in the context of the potential assassination and disappearance of all these other scientists. There is a real power struggle ongoing in America, which will end with the overthrow of the United States government in some fashion, and may ultimately take the form of the establishment of a Christian theocracy in this country, which obviously I'm keen on resisting by any and all means necessary, right? But the question then becomes, what is the alternative? And, what are the global possibilities of that alternative in terms of carving out the kind of future for humanity that, the fundamental thinkers, from Plato to Comte and Nietzsche wanted to see unfold?
It's a good question, Jason. And when it comes to certain countries out there, I'd say like Ukraine, that has pressure on it right now from being invaded by Russia, I am seeing a lot of really quick growth. I mean, say what you will about these Muslim Arab nations right now that are paying Ukraine money, but to me, that at least shows that the competency of Ukraine is being recognized the world over right now. And so maybe there is hope there. But when it comes to the Dick Cheneys of the world, if we think back to 9/11 and the kind of things that you were talking about there in relation to the possibly the Nordics, the breakaway civilization, where exactly would you say, if Dick Cheney is MJ-12, where exactly does he align or disalign with the breakaway civilization?
I am under the impression, based on the decades of research that I've done, which culminated in, I wouldn't say culminated in the book Closer Encounters in 2021, but Closer Encounters is the outcome of decades of research. And I've continued to do this research and to look at different possibilities and, modify my view in certain ways accordingly. But after decades of research that I've done on this subject, and certain background knowledge that I've had and conversations I've engaged with, conversations that I have been engaged with, I am under the impression that high-level military and intelligence officials and industrialists who they brought in, and obviously they needed, and who they used to bring most of these programs out of the purview of the state and public accountability and into the domain of private corporations, that these military, intelligence, industrial elites have, on the one hand, been making significant and in some cases disturbing concessions to the Nordics, but on the other hand, buying time to develop a deterrent. And this is a very dangerous subject to talk about, because if in fact this is the case, stealth and secrecy are of the essence in our having a fighting chance at the right moment.
So basically what like Giorgiani's like saying here is that like if Trump is for reals, and like this is basically America kind of saying like we have cracked the technology and basically like fought back this what you would deem as like fascist or globalist kind of like aspect that like has subsumed America essentially. Then there's a fighting chance for like America actually retaining its sovereignty and being able to dictate things on its own terms and all this kind of shit. And what makes me believe that Trump is actually the guy who's actually getting this shit done, why I had the debate against Lutch, Trump's the greatest president of all time, all this kind of shit, is because Trump switched the Department of Defense back into the Department of War. And that might seem minor to a lot of yous, but to me, it's sending a message.
To stage a revolt in the name of our freedom and independence, right? So, in short, I think that if these individuals wanted to simply hand the American people and the planet at large over to some hierarchical, tyrannical overlords, they would have done so already, right? I mean, suppose the Nordics come to them. It's 1952, and Eisenhower's president. And they come and say, look, we need you to keep this under wraps for a while for us because your society isn't really ready yet to integrate with us in the most constructive way. And what they really mean by that is that we haven't had enough time to dissolve the basic structures of your society to the point where, you know, your people have mush for brains and you lose all your critical capacities and religion makes a comeback and there's going to be retardation again on a mass scale. And then we can more effectively reduce you to a medieval feudal serf society, right? This is really what they mean by saying that, well, give us 50 years, give us 70, 80 years to work on your society to make people more ready to accept integration with us in a way that we can offer the proper guidance, you know, to the majority of the denizens of Earth. Look, unless they're completely stupid, the military intelligence industrialists around, let's say, Eisenhower, would have realized that giving them that kind of time in a way that completely aligns with their agenda and, you know, does their bidding sincerely is nothing other than slowly, you know, serving up humanity on a plate, right? So they would have just said, why even bother? Like, if the point is to enslave mankind, just let's say, let's disclose this tomorrow, and they'll come in their saucers and they'll just take everything over. And it may be harder for them to take over than they would like. And maybe we'll have a fighting chance, actually. But look, if the point is to hand it all over to them anyway, why buy this kind of time, right?
Why not?
The reason why you would buy the time is if you...
Why not go out and fight in terms? You know what I mean? Why not say, fuck this shit, flip the table? Unless... there is plan, comrades.
You were intending to develop countermeasures. If you were intending to play these people and to develop a kind of relationship where, you know, you're clandestinely reverse engineering things and building up an infrastructure that's capable of resisting them at the 11th hour in the crucial moment. So one may suspect that, you know, this is possibly what's been done. The problem with that, as I pointed out in many previous podcasts, is that you need a crime syndicate to do that. The kind of organization that you need to manage something like that effectively is essentially a mafia. And those kinds of organizations are just like incredibly inclined toward corruption. Right. Once you set up an unaccountable crime syndicate and you go around behaving like mafiosos, well, that's exactly what you're going to become, right? Over the long
But
run.
let's not forget that it was the Medici family that brought about the Renaissance, in part thanks to people like Gemistus Plethon, who brought the works of Plato over to them. So I don't know. Like, I see what you mean, but then there sometimes is a little bit of romance when it comes to certain rogue criminal elements that may want to take the future into their own hands. I don't know.
This is exactly the point, Lev. So, you know, that was the perfect comeback.
Now, before
I hate to say this. I really hate to say this, and we can, in Q&A, I think we'll have an opportunity to address, you know, to some extent, maybe minimal. I really don't want to get into it at great length, but what has happened in Iran over the past 4 months. In view of the catastrophic mismanagement of this war in Iran and the miscarriage of the possibility to develop a progressive and powerful replacement of the Islamic Republic in the form of a kind of Promethean Persia, there is no alternative to what you just said. None whatsoever. Everything hangs on weather. In this
Fy favore, jungle. Okay, we're getting deep and philosophical, but like I said, it's tying into like basically kind of like yesterday's episode as well. But like that's the thing about Giorgiani, you know what I'm saying? you gotta like, you know, kind of like let kind of a couple of things be unpacked, and then like I said, do the tie around. You get what I'm saying?
This crime
you know
syndicate. There are mafiosos like Lorenzo de' Medici. Period. End of discussion. there is absolutely no other concrete possibility moving forward other than that somebody like a Peter Thiel, but certainly not Peter Thiel, because from everything that I've heard and been able to put together, he's actually running the fucking Collins elite right now, clandestinely, which is incredibly cynical considering how Palantir frames itself as this quasi-Promethean organization and so forth. But somebody like a Peter Thiel or I don't even want to mention Elon Musk. I mean,
I knew you were going to say
he's
that.
such a fucking tool. I don't even want to, I know who his handlers are. I mean, he's a willfully blind person who is just being used as a finely tuned mechanism for various diversion and disinformation operations, including SpaceX, which is never going to take us to Mars in rockets, by the way. Okay. Anyway, but somebody like an Elon Musk or a, Jeff Bezos or so forth has to show up from within this corporate industrial elite that has military intelligence access.
What Giorgiani's pointing out here, and again, like I'd argue that like Marx tried to point this out as well, even though his solution was dog shit. Is there is a flaw with capitalism in terms of like there's certain areas for national interest that cannot like operate off like bottom margin or bottom line. You know what I mean? Like defense and like warfare in general, like any of that stuff, any of those companies that produce, technological military tech or weaponry and all this kind of shit. They can't just say, well, we're going to sell to the highest bidder because the highest bidder is going to be China and Russia and Iran, all this kind of shit. You know what I mean? Another aspect is like big infrastructure. Like you can't have China buying up all your farmland. Then China's responsible for your food. So if they want to cause a famine, they just pull the rug. You know what I mean? So there are certain areas in government that you need to have like the state control, or like basically state has like ultimate authority over that region. You know what I mean? Now, in terms of the rest of the society, like capitalism wins out, like your hairdressers, your barbers, your bars, your restaurants, your nightlife. Tourism is another big one. Retail, entertainment. You know what I mean? Like most of your everyday life to life is basically capitalist, but there are certain areas that need to be socialized or under state control.
And authorization. And it should be more than one individual. I mean, also the Italian Renaissance did not rest, solely on the shoulders of Lorenzo de' Medici, okay? But a group of such individuals have to fully endorse and embrace the rule of philosophers, which is an incredibly tall order. It's an incredibly tall order, and there's literally like 10 to 15 years left in which this has to happen. And if it doesn't, we are looking at thousands of years of abject human tyranny and servitude, period, end of discussion.
It's just as tall of an order as what we were talking about with the rise of the Übermensch, despite all these gravitational forces pulling us downwards. But if you are right, Jason, when it comes to the wellspring of the Übermensch occurring during these very emergency type of situations, then maybe the same would apply towards this theoretical criminal syndicate.
Exactly. And so actually, it's a kind of refutation by experiment for Nietzsche, because if these people don't show up,
thousands of years, bro. Like, think about this. If Islam takes over Britain, like, this is why you should be concerned with this as an American. You know what I mean? Because, like, geopolitics, although a lot of people are like, oh, I fucking hate talking about other countries, all that stuff. Buy a globe, motherfucker. There are certain things that you need to pay attention to, namely your enemy. People that want to see your downfall. So, when you have an Iranian regime that is chanting death to America and all this kind of shit, you should probably pay attention to that shit. Probably take note. You know what I mean? Just remember that shit. You know? And when, for example, you have Britain on the brink of becoming a fucking Islamic caliphate, ICBMs from Britain can land in America. So depending on what type of explosive you put, including nuclear, on the top of that motherfucker, they can then hit you. So all of a sudden, it's within America's interest to make sure that the British government, for example, changes its tune and starts talking about reforming things or restoring things. You know what I mean? But the key thing is that you have to be able to do that without it defaulting down to tyranny. One dude just taking over, and he's like the head honcho, and whatever he says goes, because then essentially you have yourself in a similar type situation where it's just one dude and everybody's blindly following him. You're not following that aspect of like a council of people that are enslaved to reason, for lack of a better word.
Look, there's a prophetic dimension to the writings of a philosopher, and there's a prescriptive dimension, right? And this often is lost on people in terms of their approach to my work. Sometimes people look at various things that I say, whether it's in the formal context of my philosophical writings or even whether I'm cheerleading on X, and they think that I'm making predictions or engaging in, oracular prophetic, sayings that turn out to be false and that show how grossly misguided I am. No, sometimes I'm trying to prescriptively will something into being that maybe I think is incredibly unlikely, right? But that I'm willing to invest my energy entirely in trying to possibly shift the pendulum, right? So there's a prescriptive aspect to what a philosopher does, and then there's a predictive aspect. I mean, Hegel had this idea that, the owl of wisdom only arrives at the end of an age, and that, like, philosopher, I don't really appreciate this very much, but there is an extent to which it's true that philosophers can sometimes be summarizing figures who come toward the end of an epoch, and their writing most clearly expresses and crystallizes the logic of an age. So they show the logos, the narrative structure, the inner order, the dialectical forces at play in a certain epoch of history, coming actually at the end of that epoch and kind of summarizing it and looking back on it, right? It's the owl of Minerva, in Hegel's thought. But then also there's a predictive aspect to the work of philosophers, where if you look at, some of the things that Auguste Comte wrote about, they were truly predictive. And in fact, he wrote a book, I think it was called 1927 or something like that, which was a work of science fiction. He was writing in the mid-1800s. And so there is this science fictional, Isaac Asimov type aspect to the work of somebody like Comte and Nietzsche, where Nietzsche correctly predicted that the history of the 20th century would unfold as a power struggle between America and Russia, and that Europe would become a more peripheral battleground for these, major world powers, that Europeans were, for the time being, going to be sidelined in history. Oh, and not sidelined exactly, but that they were going to be important only insofar as they were a battleground for the rising power of America and Russia. And he got that right, decades in advance of when it unfolded, right? And he made other interesting predictions that came to pass. So there's a predictive aspect of a philosopher. And if it turns out that these Renaissance men never show up, such that we can really establish the conditions for the rise of the Overman, predictively, Nietzsche will have turned out to be wrong about that. And that's a hell of a mistake to make. Okay. But it doesn't negate the worth of Nietzsche's endeavor prescriptively as an advocate of this kind of human, or let's say superhuman future, right? And so, I'm not going to say we'll have to see. Obviously,
So to surmise that, you know what I mean? Like I said, like with philosophers, typically, like I said, you have to kind of like sow the seeds and then wait, and then, like I said, it comes back. You got a beautiful yield, as they say. So like what like Giorgiani's basically saying is that like if like this whole like Trump experiment or whatever way you want to kind of like draw it, like is that kind of like mafioso and all this kind of stuff. There is potential that this actually turns into something beautiful, and like this whole kind of aspect of like Trump actually like saving the Western world or the Aryan spirit, is another way of putting it. They would need to be like philosopher kings or whatever the 2028 election is. Like that's basically going to tell us what way that like things are going to end up. Because if you get another Trump type character, essentially it's like, okay, we're just like pure tyranny. You know what I mean? But if you get like a more kind of philosophical kind of type character, aristocratic, for lack of a better word, then all of a sudden you have a more refined Republican Party, and it's literally going to become purely domestic in terms of like sorting out the issues of having what can only be described as like enemies to the state within. And what I mean by that, it's like if you're an American and you're telling me that you're also a communist, you're essentially telling me that you want to get rid of the American state. You think the Constitution is a bad idea. You know what I mean? There's no other way to put it. The ideal of a communist is to get rid of the state. We'll all have our own communes and all this kind of shit. You want to get rid of the American Constitution. You want to get rid of the federal government. You want to bring America down. So to call yourself an American communist is kind of a contradiction. It makes no sense.
I've been making great efforts in my life at great risk and grave cost to try to create these conditions and to engage with different individuals and groups that could basically coalesce into the embryonic matrix for, such an enterprise. But I haven't seen the Lorenzo de Medicis, of the black world emerge yet into the light.
Well, if you guys are out there, be sure to buy Jason's book and also patreon.com/breaktherules. We want to see you at some of the BTR NYC events in Manhattan. So next time, Jason, when you're going
By
to
the
be
way, let me say something else about that, Lev. I appreciate the plug. But frankly, these people are already reading my work. It's very clear to me, based on the conversations that I've had, especially with certain people in the deep state and intelligence, certain corporatists, that these people are already aware of my work. And so it's a question of conscience. It's a question of who they want to be. And how long do they want to wait before the situation is so dire that, all the king's men can't put it together again? Okay? And I use that phrase very deliberately. So, he who has ears, let him hear. Right, he who has ears, let him hear. There's only so much time left for us to turn this around.
Absolutely, Jason. Now, before we go to Super Chats, and I will be addressing these two Super Chats for $5 before I put up the $10 wall. That's just for the sake of making sure that we're able to get to all the Super Chats. So $10 would be the minimum. But before that, I would be remiss, Jason, and I know that we got to get to the Super Chats real soon, so I don't know how much you would be able to speak about this, but I was really interested in finding out more about Heidegger, and I have the following question for you regarding Heidegger. So
I'm only going to be going probably another 30 minutes or so, folks, purely because I need to prepare for this 24-hour stream on the weekend. Fuck. This is my fatal flaw, chat. I'm not good at promoting myself. You know what I mean? It's like I said, I need to get better at this shit. But like I said, we have the 24-hour this stream. It's going to be on obviously Sunday, I think, like my time Sunday. So I think like Saturday night at like 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't hang me on that one, okay? You know what I mean? That's I'm giving kind of like rough guidelines here, but I'm going to be making a shot at the 24 hours, so I need to make sure that I retain my sleeping pattern and all stuff. So I'm only going to be going for another 30 minutes or so, because we pretty much get into the Q&A after this one, and with Q&As, particularly with philosophers as well, who knows where we're going to end up. But essentially, like what Giorgiani kind of like pointing out here is kind of like they already kind of like know my perspective to this. And like a key thing, and that's why like the whole kind of like first hour of this, one could argue, was just like pure philosophy in terms of like the aspect and like what we're kind of trying to dig at here. Essentially kind of putting out that message to the aspect of like these elites that like actually would control the power. Because like I mentioned, in terms of this thing, if the 2020 election is rigged, then what's the chance the 2016 or the 2024 election was also rigged? You know what I mean? So in terms of like this aspect, if it is a shadow council at play, it's best to at least get the message out there and kind of like put it in perspective of like, you need, like, if you go against like what Plato outlines in the Republic of like this setup of like aristocracy, like having people that like slave themselves to reason itself, aka if there's not a reason to do it, we're not going to pursue it. Case in point, like this my body my choice, that is not an argument for abortion. That's literally because the mother said so. Because I said so. That's tyranny. Derek, how does this relate to your aristocratic republic political party? Aristocratic national republicanism. It's literally the core key philosophy to it is ingrained in what like both Giorgiani's saying, the American Constitution, and from this aspect of a critique of Marx. Like this basically comes ironically, like if you go back to I think it was last week, or it was early this, it was basically the first stream this week on Monday. If you go back to Monday stream or Sunday evening stream, Sunday night stream, study session number 2, Marxism, Communism and Global Capitalism. We basically start off with Marx, his proposed solution of communism, the critiques of communism, the fact that it's delusion, all this kind of stuff. And then we also looked into his critiques of capitalism. We then kind of like showed that like, yeah, there are certain key areas that Marx actually has he has correctly identified. These are weak areas to communism. So we need some sort of solution. Then we went into socialism, and from there we basically critiqued socialism as an aspect, especially of this kind of with no limiting principles. Then we looked at, well, limiting the principle around the nation. We built on that, so on and so forth. We ended up with aristocratic national republicanism. Because if you're not like bowing to reason, no matter what fucking form of government you try to put in, if it's a tyranny, which it will devolve in, if it's not aristocratic, it will inevitably devolve down into tyranny. It's going to be a shit show. No matter if it's free market capitalism, you have a bunch of cartels run the place. Like technically, Mexico is free market capitalism, baby. There is a synthesis between the capitalisms and the delusional communists that like actually could work out for the whole country. But like I said, going to get kind of 20 more minutes in ish of this, and like I said, we'll wrap it up. Make sure you get all your ass to VK, and make sure you get your ass to 24-hour stream as well. Probably not going to be doing a long stream tomorrow too, to make sure that the sleeping pattern stays on check.
If the Overman exists beyond the Cartesian grid that still engraves our reality, and if all knowledge is radically historicized and contingent on the prevailing paradigm of inframing or Gestell, how can we know anything authentically? Are there any limits to how fundamentally a new creator can alter or re-inframe reality itself?
So this goes back to what I was saying earlier in our conversation about how Plato and Aristotle are not as different from Nietzsche and Heidegger as people think. And that a lot of the transformation that took place deconstructively to bring about the worldview of Nietzsche and
no, an aspect to this is redact, right? And this is how powerful influencers could be. They could be this powerful, right? Imagine if you could control the dialogue of what people are talking, like the masses, that like Giorgiani was talking about, like you have the master and slave dialect and the masses and all this kind of shit. If you were able to ask such a question or put the perspective of the conversation in such a narrow way that both sides are giving you a positive solution, That's what they call a win-win solution. So no matter who you vote into office, you're getting your policy passed. And a key thing from this is if we went back to more traditional kind of like gender role setup in terms of the nuclear family, if we were to look at the nuclear family in the abstract and were to put in place the gender roles of the mother's focus is building life and the father's focus is building things and money and all this kind of shit, community, then you have a much more optimal setup, because now all of a sudden you have like half the workforce coming out anyways. And from that, that's going to elevate the wages, et cetera, et cetera. Do you know what I mean? So just going based on that aspect, that would be, if you could have a Democratic Party which had that mindset, and the only kind of real kind of like critique you could have for the Democrats is that they're trying to overspend with the government budget in terms of like supporting single mothers and all this kind of stuff. That's a much more Democratic Party than what we're seeing, especially in Rob Noor's debate. Highly recommend you go check that out. Is like this whole thing of like, yeah, to maximize women's happiness would to be more for priority than making sure that we live on as a species. This whole anti-natalism, Andrew's debated anti-natalist before. Heavily recommend you check them out. This is a key cancer that needs to be cut out without any mercy, with no mercy. You know what I mean? Because if that mentality takes place, we're all fucked. You know what I mean? And it's literally like Nero playing the violin as Rome burns to a crisp. You know what I mean?
And Heidegger was not taking Plato and Aristotle as its target, but was really deconstructing Platonism and the kind of representationalist conception of reality and the mind's relation to reality that was developed by Platonists and by Christians. Okay? So the representationalist view of the world, which is a view where truth is veritas, is the idea that there is some objectively existent reality, some cosmic lattice that would be what it is independently of the existence of the human mind. No, very important point. Independently of the existence of the human mind. But the human mind can become a microcosm that through the cultivation and purification of its rational faculties will eventually be able to perfectly mirror the structure of this lattice and to effectively describe the constitution of reality, capital R, in a way that makes scientific inventions possible because those inventions embody an understanding of the principles of nature. That's the representationalist view of the world. And again, you don't find it in Plato or in Aristotle. It's later. And it's a kind of Christian development of Platonism that leads to it. And it sort of culminates in Descartes, who frankly, as I pointed out in Prometheus and Atlas, was literally a Jesuit agent. Okay? So this conception of the world is deconstructed by Nietzsche and then further by Heidegger, who actually, if you ask me, and I think it comes across very clearly in Heidegger, are really going back toward Plato and Aristotle. And they're understanding truth as unconcealment or disclosure, where it's not possible to have an entirely accurate, universally adequate, and objective perspective on the world. In other words, number one, there's no mind of God. And number two, the human mind can't become like the mind of God and grasp reality in its totality or fundamental structure. Any truth is only a relative unconcealment or disclosure from out of predominating occultation. So the world is mostly occulted to us. We're mostly in darkness. Most of our experience is like wandering in a dark forest at night. Which Heraclitus says this, right from the beginning of philosophy. Heraclitus says this. Our apprehension of truth is like those moments when we walk toward a clearing in the forest and the moonlight streams through. The moonlight streams through the clearing, okay? And the point of developing knowledge is not so that you can ascertain what's objectively real. There's no such thing. It's so that you can more effectively craft things and more effectively craft your life than you would be able to if you're operating on baseless opinion. Okay? So someone who's deluded, massively deluded, thinks the earth is flat, worships roosters,
damn.
whatever, engages in all kinds of ridiculous pagan
We gotta
rites.
show respect to Abraxas a bit, but yeah.
Does the whole crystal things, does the whole astrology thing, all this kind of shit.
Right. So, yeah, but you get my point. So, such a person is not going to be able to very effectively craft tools that empower them to inhabit the world in a more effective way, nor are they going to be able to cultivate their lives with very much sophistication at all, right? And cultivation is an important, descriptor here because.
And like this is a thing like with reason and logic and like I have the whole meme with the logos by like for example like fallacious reasoning, like faulty logic, like the more you start to notice things like this person, anytime they have an issue with something, they always kind of say they start attacking the person and not the argument being made. You know what I mean? Like the more you kind of stop listening to those types of people and start listening to more people that give like sound reasoning, where it's like they explain that like the conclusion has to necessarily follow. There's no other possibilities, as well as like the premises that they're putting forward are like actually true and they're able to prove how they're true and all this stuff. Do you know what I mean? And yeah, Jungle, like I said, I had to give a shout out to because you gotta appreciate the memes. You know what I mean? But yeah, like I said, kind of like in terms of like that essence, like that's kind of like how like reason, like this whole thing like people say, oh, like I'm not a debate, bro. It's like reason transcends debate. You use debate to highlight the value of reason. Why it's called reasoning with someone. You know what I mean? But like using reason in your life and especially being able to pick up on things and adhere to reason, like be the slave to reason. Your life gets fucking your whole perspective changes. And it's some people can handle the roller coaster, other people can't. You know what I mean? It is what it is.
Like, for example, you cultivate a wine vineyard, and that's also a form of techne. Techne is the root of our word technology, but techne for the Greeks also meant, for example, the craft of vineyard cultivation, right? And so the idea in Plato and Aristotle, which Nietzsche and Heidegger are really coming back to, is that the ignorant man who lives according to baseless opinions is not effective. The word excellence in Aristotle, which the Christians misinterpreted as a kind of goody two-shoes moral descriptor, namely arete, right? What they translate as virtue often in the translations of Aristotle. That term arete really means excellence. In other words, being astonishingly effective, right? Doing something superbly. Being able to operate in an ingenious way, right? And so Plato and Aristotle are engaged in that kind of.
And like this is where like I would say certain shit and like Giorgiani would fucking like flip the table on me and all this kind of shit. But what he's describing there is like that's what I see in Trump in terms of like unpredictability. Like another way to view geniuses is like you never see like what they have coming until it's like too late and they have you beat. You know what I mean? But I think we have Jungle roasting in chat as well, saying someone told me Shanti smells truffles, then assumes mod duties. She's such a badass for that. W Teriak, hey, fi favore, fi favore. The roasting continues. Darth, I went in blind on listening. That cucumber melon is about my mom. Had one blue eye, one green eye. That one killed me, fighting it like a little bitch. God damn. Everybody's taking shots. Take cover.
Kind of an enterprise where I argue, I mean, I recapitulate this. I first argued this in Lovers of Sophia, and I recapitulated in my chapter on Plato in Fundamental Thinkers, that even for Plato, the forms ultimately serve a pedagogical purpose. They are meant to refine and cultivate the intellectual capacity as projections that are useful to free oneself from customary, misguided ways of looking at the world. Okay? They're a disillusionment mechanism and a way to refine one's mind and to prepare the ground for other forms of intuition, which Aristotle calls noesis, that are not dependent upon objectively existent principles. Okay? The idea of objectively existent principles is a pedagogical machination. And the man first deploying them, namely Plato, was a playwright who had a tremendous aesthetic sensibility and an aesthetic orientation to the way in which he wanted to reorganize the ethos of society. I mean, you can see this. There's a very interesting duality in Plato's Republic, where on the one hand, he's got his philosopher legislators banning certain forms of poetry because he considers them degenerative for the moral fiber of the youth. And he has some very harsh things to say about Homer, okay? But then on the other hand, his entire blueprint for the reorganization of society is couched in aesthetic metaphors that are quasi-mythic, okay, where he's becoming an engineer of folklore. And so my point is that you don't need an objectively existent reality or transcendental moral principles in order to justify the way in which philosophical thought cultivates a more sophisticated and excellent human being that is going to be able to foster social flourishing. You follow?
And that's what I would argue is like at the depths of Christianity, but Giorgiani would disagree. So like I said, this is why you gotta have harsh critics. You know what I mean? Because if they're actually like if you're able to create something or do something that even like even your enemy says, you know what, bro, like I gotta respect you for that one. You know what I mean? That's when you know you've reached a good place. And speaking about perfection, Jungle again with the roast say, oh, so Tarek isn't exempt from roast. Bro read like he's sounding out alphabet soup through a mouthful of expired tuna, purple drank, because he tasted an African mama once and has never forgotten. Hey, what was it, Tainiqua? Or Shaika? I don't know, man. It's goofy as fuck. Goofy as fuck, to say the least. But like I said, I appreciate the roast. I forgot to like the video because Terry can't read worth a damn. Hey, what can I say? I'm Irish. You know what I mean? And I'm dang proud of it, boy. Look at that shamrock. Look at them shoes. Look at that dicky bow. You know what I'm saying? But anyways, folks, like I said, I'm going to wrap it up here. That's, like I said, the key thing with what's going on right now, especially where it's like we have crazy shit like the UFO stuff, being Trump's meeting with China. You're getting like basically a psyop every fucking 2 hours at this stage. But anyways, appreciate you all very kindly. But just like changing up your perspective. That's the main thing. And just to kind of try and like hold things in a big picture perspective. That's like the key thing what I'm trying to go for. And like I said, I got a big debate coming up on the 19th. It's going to be a good one. It's going to be a spicy one. I might get shot over it. You know what I'm saying? Okay, I like the video. Today, brother. Today. The only way to defy that is through me. It was Jesus who said that. Do you know the way? But anyway, like I said, don't gotta trust me, folks. Okay? All I'm simply asking you is to trust your president. We end the show the same way. Yeah, I actually can't speak today. I'm not gonna lie. Baby Jungle's right. You know what I'm saying? Have fun. Appreciate you kindly, my man. But God bless America. God bless Donald Trump. I'll see you all tomorrow for a little bit of chat and chill, baby.
Why wouldn't you dedicate yourself to public service?
Because I think it's a very mean life. I would love and I would dedicate my life to this country, but I see it as being a mean life, and I also see it as somebody with strong views and somebody with the kind of views that are maybe a little bit unpopular, which may be right, but may be unpopular.
I am your voice. So to every parent who dreams for their child and every child who dreams for their future, I say these words to you tonight. I am with you, I will fight for you, and I will win for you. We will make America strong again. We will make America safe again.